This is my sister Valerie. We do not talk about her much because she is the family failure. Jasmine laughed loudly, pulling me by my arm toward her fiancé Declan Gallagher. My mother Loretta stood right behind us, nodding in agreement. We certainly do not brag about her. Declan turned around to greet us. He had a confident smile that vanished the second his eyes met mine. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor. He turned pale green and whispered quietly, "So it is you, this is unexpected." What my smug sister and arrogant parents did not know was that Declan recognized me because I was the shadow investor keeping his dying tech company alive. My name is Valerie, and I am 31 years old. I spent my entire life being treated like dirt by my own family while they worshipped my younger sister Jasmine. They thought I was a broke college dropout. They had no idea I was a senior partner at Vanguard Apex Venture Capital. Before I tell you how this wedding turned into the ultimate exposure of their fake lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that the best revenge is massive success. To understand the incredible tension in that Atlanta hotel lobby, you need to know how the day started. The venue was breathtakingly expensive. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring ceilings, reflecting golden light onto the imported Italian marble floors. Jasmine had demanded a wedding that screamed old money and unlimited wealth. She wore a custom silk gown that cost more than my first car. Our parents, Calvin and Loretta, paraded her around the room like a prize-winning trophy. Calvin is a well-known pastor in our community, and Loretta is a prominent socialite. To them, maintaining flawless appearances is more important than oxygen. When I arrived at the venue wearing a simple but elegant tailored suit, they immediately panicked. They tried to hide me in the back corners of the room. They wanted me out of sight so their wealthy friends would not ask uncomfortable questions. But Jasmine spotted me standing near the entrance. She saw a golden opportunity to belittle me in front of her new powerful friends and her future husband. She marched across the room and grabbed my arm with a tight, aggressive grip. Her perfectly manicured nails dug sharply into my skin. She did not say hello. She just yanked me toward the center of the room where Declan was entertaining a large group of his groomsmen and wealthy business partners. Jasmine interrupted his conversation with a loud theatrical voice designed to draw maximum attention from everyone nearby. She introduced me, not with love, but with pure malice and cruelty. She called me the family failure right to his face, making sure the groomsmen could hear every single word. She told him I dropped out of medical school years ago and probably sold cheap insurance policies out of a rusty sedan. Loretta stepped up right beside her, smoothing down her expensive lace dress with a haughty expression. Loretta added her own toxic remark to the mix. She claimed I was the one child they prayed for constantly, but could never seem to fix. The groomsmen chuckled awkwardly, unsure of how to respond to such blatant hostility. A few church elders standing nearby shook their heads in fake pity, whispering judgments under their breath. Jasmine looked at me with a sickening smirk that communicated absolute victory. She genuinely thought she had completely humiliated me in front of the man she claimed was a tech billionaire. She wanted me to feel small, worthless, and completely out of my league. But I did not flinch. I did not cry. I did not run away in shame. I simply stood my ground, looked directly at Declan, and waited patiently for his reaction. That brings us back to the shattered champagne glass. The sharp sound of crystal breaking echoed loudly across the suddenly quiet lobby. The awkward laughter died instantly. Jasmine let go of my arm and jumped back quickly to avoid the splashing liquid on her expensive shoes. She looked at Declan with a deeply confused expression. She reached out and asked him if he was okay. Declan did not answer her at all. He could not even look at her. His eyes were locked entirely onto mine, filled with absolute, unadulterated terror. He recognized me immediately. Just 2 weeks prior, I sat in a dimly lit boardroom evaluating his struggling company for a $50 million bailout. I was introduced to him only as VW, the senior partner who held his entire professional future in her hands. Now that same highly respected executive was standing right in front of him, being publicly humiliated and verbally abused by his future wife and her parents. I offered him a cold, highly professional smile. I looked him up and down and told him congratulations on the wedding. I added that I sincerely hoped his third quarter financial reports were looking much better than his current pale complexion. Declan started sweating profusely, droplets forming on his forehead. He stammered uselessly, completely unable to form a single coherent sentence. Calvin rushed over in a panic, demanding to know what I had said to upset the wealthy groom. Loretta tried to apologize frantically to Declan for my presence, completely oblivious to the real situation. They thought I had offended him. They had absolutely no idea that Declan was actually terrified of me and my power. I stood silently in the center of the chaos, deeply enjoying every single second of his pathetic panic. The first domino had just fallen, and my family was entirely unprepared for the absolute destruction that was about to follow today. The tension in the lobby was quickly swept under the rug as the wedding party moved into the private dining room for the rehearsal dinner. The room was decorated with expensive floral arrangements and soft candlelight. I sat at the far end of a long mahogany table, nursing a glass of sparkling water. Declan sat at the opposite end, refusing to make eye contact with me. He kept wiping his forehead with a cloth napkin, looking like a man walking to his own execution. Jasmine, however, was completely oblivious to her future husband's internal meltdown. She was too busy glowing under the constant praise of our parents and their wealthy friends. Halfway through the main course, Calvin tapped his fork against his crystal water glass to get everyone to quiet down. He stood up and gave a lengthy speech about how proud he was of Jasmine. He called her a beacon of success and a perfect example of hard work and dedication. Then his eyes locked onto me, and his warm smile melted into a cold, calculated stare. He walked over to my end of the table, pulling a thick manila envelope from his tailored suit jacket. Loretta followed closely behind him, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Jasmine sat back in her chair with a smug smile, watching the scene unfold like she was enjoying a highly entertaining movie. Calvin placed the envelope on the table right next to my plate. He spoke loudly enough for the people sitting nearby to hear every word. He said that since Jasmine was starting her new life with a prominent businessman like Declan, she needed to expand her dermatology clinic to keep up with their new elevated social status. He said the family had decided that the perfect wedding gift would be the downtown apartment that my grandmother left me before she passed away. He pushed a silver pen toward me and told me to sign the transfer papers inside the envelope immediately. He said it was the absolute least I could do for the family, considering how little I had contributed to our good reputation over the past 10 years. I stared at the thick envelope, feeling a familiar wave of disgust wash over my entire body. That apartment was the only thing I owned that had any real sentimental value. Grandma Dorothy was the only person in this family who actually believed in my potential. She left me that small property because she knew my parents would never support my ambitions or give me a safety net. I looked up at Calvin and calmly asked him why I should give up my only inheritance to fund an expansion for a medical clinic that was supposed to be highly profitable and successful. Loretta gasped loudly, placing a trembling hand over her expensive pearl necklace. She leaned in close to my face and lowered her voice, hissing at me to stop being so incredibly selfish in front of their important guests. She said Jasmine deserved a proper clinic in a high-end neighborhood, not just a rented space in a regular commercial building. I reminded my mother that Jasmine already had everything handed to her on a silver platter since the day she was born. I pointed out that when Jasmine wanted to go to medical school, they happily took out a massive second mortgage on their house to pay for her tuition, her luxury campus apartment, and her lavish trips to Europe every single summer. Meanwhile, when I was accepted into an Ivy League business program, they flatly refused to help me. They would not even agree to be guarantors on my student loans because they said a business degree was a complete waste of time for a woman who lacked natural talent. I had to work 3 grueling jobs just to pay for my textbooks and rent a tiny damp room in a stranger's basement. Jasmine slammed her hand flat on the table, causing the silverware to rattle loudly. Her face turned bright red with anger. She told me to stop playing the eternal victim right this second. She said she was a real doctor and her career actually mattered to society, unlike whatever shady freelance internet work I was doing to barely survive. She demanded that I pick up the pen and sign the legal papers, claiming that keeping the apartment was just me being greedy and trying to hold her back from reaching her full potential. She said true family members make major sacrifices for each other, and it was about time for me to finally step up and do my part to elevate the family name. I picked up the silver pen and rolled it slowly between my fingers. The entire dining table was watching me now, waiting to see if I would cave to the heavy pressure, just like I always did when I was a helpless teenager. Calvin crossed his arms, looking down at me with an expression of absolute, unquestionable authority. He told me that if I did not sign those property transfer papers right now, I would be completely cut off from the family forever. He said I would not be welcome to attend the actual wedding ceremony tomorrow, and he would make sure everyone in our tight-knit community knew exactly what a terrible, ungrateful daughter I truly was. He thought the heavy threat of being publicly ostracized would break my spirit. He genuinely thought I desperately craved their approval and validation. What he did not understand was that I had stopped caring about their toxic approval a long decade ago. I did not need their money, their fake status, or their highly conditional love. I certainly did not need to be part of a family that only valued my existence for what financial assets they could forcefully extract from me. I looked over at Declan, who was now staring intensely at his dinner plate, gripping his metal fork so tightly his knuckles were turning completely white. He knew exactly what kind of ruthless woman he was marrying into, and he was absolutely terrified of what was coming next. I set the expensive silver pen down on the clean tablecloth, placing it far away from the manila envelope. I looked Calvin dead in the eye and told him I would not be signing anything today, tomorrow, or ever in this lifetime. I told him the downtown apartment belonged solely to me, and if Jasmine wanted a bigger dermatology clinic, she could go down to a local bank and apply for a standard commercial loan just like any other independent business owner. The heavy silence in the dining room was completely deafening. No one had ever dared to speak to the highly respected pastor like that, let alone his massive disappointment of a daughter. Loretta looked like she was about to pass out from the sheer shock, and Jasmine's jaw dropped open in pure disbelief. I picked up my cloth napkin, wiped my mouth very slowly, and stood up from the large mahogany table, leaving the unsigned legal papers sitting right next to my half-eaten dinner. The heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the floor as I turned to walk away. Before I could even take 3 steps toward the heavy oak doors, Calvin slammed his fists down on the mahogany table. The expensive china rattled and a wineglass tipped over, spilling dark red liquid across the pristine white tablecloth. He ordered me to stop right where I was standing. His voice boomed through the private dining room with the practiced authority of a man who was used to commanding hundreds of people from a pulpit. He told me that if I walked out that door without signing the property transfer, I would no longer be considered his daughter. He said he would personally march into his church on Sunday morning and announce to the entire congregation that I was dead to him. He threatened to erase my name from the family tree entirely. He said I would not be welcome at holidays, birthdays, or even their funerals. He told me I would be entirely cut off from the community and left to rot in my own miserable, selfish little world. Loretta immediately started sobbing softly, pressing a silk handkerchief to her dry eyes. She wailed about how she had failed as a mother to raise such a greedy and ungrateful child. She looked at the wealthy guests around the table, playing the perfect victim. She said she had tried everything to fix my rebellious nature, but I was just born with a cold heart. Jasmine crossed her arms over her chest and smirked. She told me I was making the biggest mistake of my pathetic life. She said when my shady freelance jobs finally dried up and I ended up homeless on the streets of Atlanta, I should not even bother calling her luxury clinic for a handout. She said she and Declan were about to build an absolute empire, and I was going to be left in the dirt exactly where I belonged. I stood perfectly still and let their toxic words wash over me. I did not feel angry or sad. I only felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I looked at Calvin and told him that being erased from his fake perfect family was not a punishment, but the ultimate reward. I told him he could go ahead and tell his church whatever lies he wanted to invent. I reminded him that I had built my entire life from the ground up without a single dime of his money or a single ounce of his support. I told him my name was already off his family tree because I had carved my own path a long time ago. Calvin turned purple with rage. He opened his mouth to shout another threat, but a sudden sharp sound cut through the tense atmosphere. It was a phone ringing. Not just any phone, but the highly secured business phone sitting in Declan's jacket pocket. The sudden noise startled everyone in the dead silent room. Declan jumped in his seat. He pulled the phone out and looked at the screen. The color completely drained from his face when he saw the caller ID. He had been ignoring calls all evening, but he muttered a frantic apology to the table and answered this one immediately. He pressed the phone to his ear with trembling fingers. The room was so quiet that we could all hear the panicked voice of his executive assistant leaking through the speaker. The assistant was speaking incredibly fast. He told Declan that they had a massive emergency on their hands. He said they just received an urgent email from the legal team at Vanguard Apex Venture Capital. The assistant was almost hyperventilating as he delivered the news. He said VW, the elusive shadow partner who controlled the $50 million bailout fund, was physically present at the wedding venue right now. The assistant said VW was currently evaluating the entire executive team based on their behavior and character today. If she saw anything she did not like, she was going to pull the funding immediately and let the company go completely bankrupt by Monday morning. The assistant begged Declan to find this woman immediately and do whatever it took to keep her happy. He said her legal team confirmed she was in the building, but they refused to provide her full name or a photograph. Declan slowly lowered the phone from his ear. His hands were shaking so violently that he almost dropped the expensive device onto his plate. He swallowed hard. His breathing became shallow and erratic. His eyes slowly lifted from the table and locked onto me standing near the heavy oak doors. He remembered the exact words I had spoken to him in the hotel lobby just an hour ago. He remembered me mentioning his third-quarter financial reports and the bailout. He remembered the cold, professional way I had analyzed his panic. He put the pieces together in his head. The realization hit him like a freight train. The woman his new family was currently abusing, screaming at, and trying to disown was the exact same woman who held his entire multi-million-dollar company in the palm of her hand. I was VW. I was Valerie Williams. I was the shadow boss of Vanguard Apex. Declan broke out in a freezing cold sweat. His expensive custom suit was suddenly sticking to his back. He stared at me in absolute unadulterated horror. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and was waiting for the inevitable explosion. Jasmine noticed his bizarre reaction and grabbed his arm. She loudly asked him what was wrong and why he looked like he had just seen a ghost. Calvin and Loretta also stared at him, completely confused by his sudden physical collapse. I did not say a single word to clarify the situation for them. I simply looked right into Declan's terrified eyes and gave him one last chilling smile. I let him simmer in his own absolute terror. I turned around, pushed open the heavy oak doors, and walked smoothly out of the private dining room. The sound of my heels clicking down the marble hallway echoed softly behind me, leaving the entire toxic family trapped in a room with a groom who now knew his life was entirely over. The next afternoon, the Atlanta sun beat down on the sprawling grounds of the historic Botanical Gardens, where Jasmine was finally having her multi-million-dollar wedding. The ceremony was a ridiculous display of fake wealth and forced prestige. Rows of imported white orchids lined the massive marble walkway, and a live string quartet played soft classical music as the guests began to arrive. These were not just any guests. They were the absolute elite of Calvin's congregation and Loretta's high society social clubs. The women wore massive designer hats and custom silk dresses, while the men sported tailored tuxedos and expensive gold watches. It was a sea of judgment and hypocrisy wrapped in fine fabrics. I arrived just as the ceremony was about to begin, wearing the same simple but incredibly expensive tailored suit from the day before. I walked down the aisle to find my seat, but the whispers started before I even made it halfway to the second row. The church gossips were already hard at work. I could hear Sister Mildred and Deacon Hayes muttering under their breath about my outfit and my supposed attitude problem. Loretta had clearly spent her entire morning doing damage control. She had been walking around telling anyone who would listen that I was going through a severe mental crisis and that I had cruelly refused to give my only sister a wedding gift out of pure spite. The community looked at me with a mixture of fake pity and blatant disgust. They whispered that it was such a shame the good pastor had to deal with such a rebellious and broken child. I ignored all of them and took my seat. When the bridal march finally played, Jasmine walked down the aisle, looking like a smug, victorious queen. She smiled brightly at the adoring crowd, soaking up all the attention and false validation she desperately craved. Calvin walked her down the aisle, with his chest puffed out in total pride. But when Jasmine finally reached the altar and handed her bouquet to her bridesmaid, the illusion began to crack just a tiny bit. Declan was standing there waiting for her, but he looked absolutely terrible. His skin was the color of old ash, and his hands were visibly shaking. He could barely look Jasmine in the eye as he recited his vows. His voice was hollow and terrified. The guests just assumed he was overwhelmed with emotion, but I knew the truth. He had spent his entire wedding night frantically trying to figure out how to save his company from the woman sitting quietly in the second row. After the agonizingly long ceremony concluded, the guests were ushered into the grand ballroom for the lavish reception. The room was completely transformed into a winter wonderland, with thousands of hanging crystals and massive towers of white roses. As everyone began finding their seats, I walked over to the gilded seating chart displayed near the entrance. I traced my finger down the alphabetical list and found my name. Jasmine had not placed me at the family table. She had not even placed me near the extended relatives or the church elders. She had assigned me to table 42. I walked across the massive ballroom, passing table after table of laughing guests, clinking expensive champagne glasses. Table 42 was pushed all the way into the darkest back corner of the room, directly next to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. I pulled out my chair and sat down, looking at my table mates. Jasmine had purposely seated me with the hired chauffeurs, the backup photographers, and the tired catering staff who were taking their mandatory breaks. It was a calculated public insult designed to remind me of my exact place in the family hierarchy. She wanted the entire affluent community to see that the successful Dr. Bride was completely distancing herself from her absolute failure of a sister. The chauffeurs looked at me awkwardly, shifting in their seats as the lavish multi-course dinner began to arrive. They probably expected me to throw a massive fit or storm out of the reception in tears. Instead, I politely introduced myself, tucked a pristine white napkin over my lap, and began to eat my prime rib with absolute serenity. The food was actually quite good, and being far away from Calvin and Loretta gave me the perfect quiet space to conduct my actual business. While the rest of the ballroom cheered and clapped for the ridiculous wedding toasts, I reached into my suit pocket and pulled out my secured business phone. Jasmine thought she was punishing me by putting me in the shadows. She did not realize that the shadows were exactly where I operated best. I opened my encrypted email application and pulled up the final contracts from my legal team. For the past 48 hours, Vanguard Apex had been quietly acquiring the massive commercial debt that Jasmine's dermatology clinic had racked up. She had taken out several reckless loans to fund her lavish lifestyle and pay for the expensive laser equipment she barely knew how to use. Her clinic had been operating at a massive loss for months, and the original banks were thrilled to sell her toxic debt to my firm for a steep discount. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water as I reviewed the final numbers on the glowing screen. The The total debt with accumulated penalties came out to just over $3 million. Jasmine had put the clinic down as collateral, but she had also quietly leveraged the remaining equity in Calvin and Loretta's house to secure a secondary line of credit. They were all tied together in a massive sinking financial ship, and they had absolutely no idea. I watched Jasmine smiling and dancing on the illuminated floor, completely oblivious to the fact that she was currently twirling around in a dress paid for with borrowed money she could never repay. Declan caught my eye from the head table. He was not eating. He was just staring at me sitting in the dark corner with my phone in my hand. He knew I was the single most powerful person in that entire building. He watched in frozen horror as I tapped the screen to electronically sign the final transfer documents. With one single press of my finger, the transaction was fully processed and legally binding. I was now the sole owner of all my sister's debt. If she missed even one payment, I had the legal right to seize her clinic, her medical equipment, and the very house our parents slept in. I locked my phone, slipped it back into my pocket, and raised my water glass toward Declan in a silent, mocking toast. His face completely crumbled as he realized the absolute nightmare was only just beginning. The clinking of silverware against fine china slowly faded into the background as the live string quartet stopped playing their classical music. A bright spotlight suddenly illuminated the center of the grand ballroom floor. Calvin stepped up to the microphone with extreme confidence. He adjusted his tailored tuxedo jacket and cleared his throat. He let a warm and heavily practiced smile spread across his face. This was entirely his element. As a prominent pastor in the city, he knew exactly how to captivate an audience. He knew how to bend their emotions to his ultimate will. He looked out over the massive sea of wealthy guests and began a speech that was so incredibly hypocritical, it almost made me laugh out loud right there in my seat. He started his speech by talking extensively about the concept of Black excellence and generational wealth. He proudly pointed his hand at Jasmine, who was sitting at the head table. She was sitting next to a visibly sweating and terrified Declan. Calvin called my sister the absolute pride of their community and a shining example for young women everywhere. He praised her for her supposed tireless work ethic. He praised her dedication to the medical field and her flawless moral compass. He painted a grand picture of a young woman who had built an incredible empire through nothing but sheer determination and deep religious faith. The entire ballroom erupted in loud applause. The wealthy church elders nodded their heads in agreement. They wiped away fake tears of joy. I sat in my dark corner at table 42. I quietly chewed on a piece of roasted asparagus and watched the massive delusion unfold before my eyes. It was truly a masterclass in psychological manipulation. But Calvin was not quite finished with his performance. A charismatic pastor always needs a dark, cautionary tale to make the righteous look even better by comparison. His booming voice dropped an octave, taking on a heavy tone of deep sorrow and parental disappointment. He started talking about how easy it is for some people to lose their way in this unforgiving modern world. He did not say my name out loud, but he absolutely did not need to. Every single eye in that massive ballroom began to shift slowly toward the back corner. They were all looking at where I was sitting with the catering staff and the hired drivers. He talked about the deep pain of watching a child reject family values. He talked about the pain of watching them turn their back on their community and choose a lonely path of bitter selfishness. He told the crowd that true success is not measured by independence or career titles. He said it is measured by how much you are willing to sacrifice for the people who raised you. He looked directly at me over the heads of the affluent crowd. He made sure everyone knew exactly who the villain of his story was. He told the silent room that sometimes negative influences trick us into holding on to meaningless material possessions. He said we hold on to these things instead of embracing the beautiful spirit of family generosity. It was a thinly veiled public attack deliberately designed to shame me. He was punishing me for refusing to give up my grandmother's apartment. He wanted to use the immense peer pressure of hundreds of wealthy guests to crush my boundaries and force my hand. Loretta was sitting at the head table dabbing her eyes with a silk napkin. She was playing the part of the long-suffering mother perfectly. Jasmine was smirking widely. She was completely unaware that the man sitting next to her was currently planning his desperate escape route. After the heavy applause finally died down, Calvin did something that proved exactly how ruthless and calculated he truly was. He did not just return to his seat at the head table. Instead, he stepped off the grand stage and began walking directly down the center aisle of the ballroom. He was heading straight for table 42. As he walked, a short, balding man wearing a cheap gray suit scurried out from the crowd and quickly joined him. I recognized the man immediately. It was Brother Davis, the lead legal counsel for Calvin's church. He was a miserable man known for bullying vulnerable congregation members. He pressured them into signing away their personal assets for the so-called glory of the ministry. The entire room watched in hushed anticipation as the two men approached my table in the dark corner. The chauffeurs and waiters sitting around me stiffened in their chairs. They looked incredibly uncomfortable and wanted to disappear. Calvin stopped right in front of me, completely blocking my view of the illuminated dance floor. He looked down at me with cold, dead eyes that completely contradicted the warm, pastoral smile still plastered tightly on his face. Brother Davis immediately unlatched his battered leather briefcase. He pulled out the exact same manila envelope from the rehearsal dinner the night before. He placed it directly on top of my dinner plate. He completely ruined my expensive meal. Calvin spoke in a low, threatening voice that was amplified just enough for the nearby tables to hear every single word. He said he was giving me one final chance to do the right thing and redeem myself in the eyes of this community. He demanded that I sign the property transfer papers. He demanded I gift the apartment to my sister so she could expand her incredibly successful medical practice. Brother Davis chimed in using a condescending tone usually reserved for scolding unruly children. He told me that since I was currently estranged from the family, they could easily tie the property up in endless probate litigation. He said they would claim my grandmother was not of sound mind when she left the apartment to me. He threatened to drown me in endless legal fees until I had absolutely nothing left to my name. It was a classic intimidation tactic used by small-minded men. They thought because I was sitting with the hired help, I was weak. They thought I was broke and easily bullied into submission. They desperately wanted to publicly strip me of my only remaining family asset to fund the grand illusion of Jasmine's success. The dark irony of the situation was so incredibly thick, you could cut it with a steak knife. They were actively threatening a billionaire venture capitalist with cheap legal fees over a tiny downtown apartment. They did this while I literally owned the multi-million-dollar debt that was about to destroy their entire pathetic lives. I did not touch the envelope sitting on my plate. I did not flinch, cry, or look away from their aggressive stares. I slowly picked up my cloth napkin and wiped the corners of my mouth with perfect composure. The catering staff sitting next to me were holding their breath. They were waiting for me to crack under the immense pressure. I looked directly up at Brother Davis. I asked him if he was actively advising a church member to commit fraud by contesting a legally binding will without any actual medical evidence. The little lawyer sputtered nervously. His face turned a dark shade of red as he looked around the room. I then shifted my gaze back to Calvin. I kept my voice calm, steady, and completely devoid of any raw emotion. I told him that manipulating a congregation for cheap sympathy was one thing, but bringing a desperate church lawyer to harass a guest at a wedding reception was just incredibly tacky and embarrassing for him. Calvin slammed his heavy hand on the back of my wooden chair. He leaned in so close that I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. He told me I was a worthless, ungrateful mistake. He said by tomorrow morning he would make absolutely sure everyone in Atlanta knew I was dead to the family. He whispered that I would end up with absolutely nothing. I just smiled up at him with a genuine, relaxed expression. I told him he was absolutely right about one specific thing. By tomorrow morning, everything was going to change forever. But I promised him calmly that I was not the one who was going to lose everything. I casually pushed the manila envelope off my plate. I let it fall onto the sticky floor of the catering area. I told him to take his cheap lawyer and get out of my lighting because I was simply trying to enjoy my prime rib in peace. Calvin stared at the envelope on the floor and then glared at me with a hatred so pure it practically vibrated in the air. He realized I was not going to break. He spun around and marched back toward the head table with Brother Davis scurrying right behind him like a frightened rat. I took another bite of my dinner, completely unbothered by the spectacle. The catering staff just stared at me in absolute awe. I finished my meal in peace while the rest of the wedding guests slowly returned to their conversations and the band started playing upbeat dance music. After about 20 minutes, the air in the back corner felt a bit too stuffy, so I stood up and decided to take a quiet walk toward the outdoor patio. As I walked past the heavy velvet curtains near the service exit, a hand suddenly shot out from the shadows. Cold, clammy fingers wrapped around my wrist and jerked me into a dimly lit maintenance hallway. I did not scream because I already knew exactly who it was. The expensive cologne mixed with the sharp scent of pure panic was a dead giveaway. Declan stood before me looking absolutely pathetic. The confident, glowing groom from the altar was completely gone. His expensive tuxedo jacket was unbuttoned, and his silk tie was hanging loosely around his neck. He was breathing heavily, staring at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. He looked up and down the empty corridor to make sure no one had followed us. Then he did something I never expected a man of his supposed stature to do. His knees buckled and he dropped straight down to the dirty linoleum floor. He fell right at my feet, ruining his expensive tailored pants. He clasped his trembling hands together and looked up at me like a condemned man looking at his executioner. His voice cracked as he started begging. He called me Miss Williams and pleaded with me to listen to him. He apologized profusely for everything that had happened in the lobby and at the rehearsal dinner. He swore on his life that he had absolutely no idea who I was when Jasmine was insulting me. I looked down at the top of his perfectly styled hair and felt a deep wave of disgust. I told him to stop whining and stand up like a man, but he refused to move. He stayed on his knees and started frantically confessing everything. The dam had completely broken. He told me that his health tech startup was not just struggling, it was on the absolute brink of total financial collapse. He admitted that he had been lying to the media, his employees, and even his new bride about the true valuation of his company. He was completely out of cash and missing payroll. The $50 million investment from Vanguard Apex was the only thing standing between him and federal bankruptcy court. He begged me not to pull the funding just because his new family was incredibly toxic. I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out my secured business phone. I opened the voice memo application and pressed the red record button. I held the phone down near his face and calmly asked him to repeat exactly what he had just said. Declan stared at the glowing screen for a second, but he was far too desperate to care about the legal implications of a recorded confession. He repeated his pathetic plea. He confessed that his company was insolvent. He admitted that his entire billionaire persona was a carefully constructed lie to keep his early investors from panicking. He even admitted that marrying Jasmine was partly a strategic public relations move to make him look like a stable family man to the board of directors. I saved the audio file and uploaded it directly to my secure cloud server, right in front of his tear-filled eyes. I looked down at him and told him that my firm did not make investment decisions based on petty family drama. We made them based on the integrity of the founder. I told him that right now his integrity was worth absolutely nothing to me. Declan started sobbing quietly, burying his face in his hands. He asked me what I wanted him to do. He asked if he should go out there and tell Jasmine the truth. He asked if he should cancel the honeymoon and file for bankruptcy in the morning. I leaned down slightly and forced him to look me in the eye. I kept my voice low, steady, and incredibly cold. I told him he was not going to say a single word to Jasmine or my parents. I ordered him to keep his mouth completely shut about my true identity. I told him that as far as his new family was concerned, I was still the broke, pathetic failure who sat in the corner with the catering staff. I commanded him to get off his knees, wipe his face, and walk back out to the reception. I told him he was going to hold Jasmine's hand smile for the expensive photographers and play the role of the incredibly wealthy groom flawlessly. Declan looked terrified and confused. He asked me why I was doing this and what my ultimate endgame was. I smiled at him, but it was a smile devoid of any warmth. I told him he did not have the clearance to know my endgame. I told him that Vanguard Apex would continue processing the $50 million bailout on one strict condition. He was now my puppet. I told him that whenever I pulled the strings, he would dance exactly the way I wanted him to. If he ever disobeyed me, if he ever breathed a word of this conversation to my sister, I would not just pull the funding. I promised him I would personally hand this voice recording to the Securities and Exchange Commission and watch him go to federal prison for investor fraud. He swallowed hard and nodded his head rapidly, agreeing to every single demand I made. He scrambled to his feet, leaning against the concrete wall for support. He clumsily fixed his silk tie and tried to button his tuxedo jacket with violently shaking fingers. I looked at his pale, ruined face and told him to go back to his beautiful bride before she started looking for him. I warned him to make sure his smile looked genuine because I would be watching him from the back of the room. Declan turned around and stumbled down the dark hallway, heading back toward the bright lights and the loud music of his fake perfect wedding. I stayed in the shadows for a moment longer, enjoying the absolute silence. I had the golden child's husband entirely in my pocket, and the real destruction had not even started yet. I waited in the cool darkness of the maintenance hallway for a few moments, letting the weight of my absolute power settle over me. The heavy thumping of the bass from the reception hall echoed softly through the walls, vibrating against the floorboards. I finally stepped out from the shadows, smoothing down the pristine fabric of my tailored suit. I was ready to return to my quiet table in the back corner and watch the rest of the miserable evening unfold from a safe distance. But as I turned the corner toward the main corridor, my exit was suddenly blocked. Jasmine was storming down the carpeted hallway, her heavy silk wedding gown rustling loudly with every angry step she took. She had been wandering the venue looking for Declan. It was almost time for the traditional cutting of the cake, and her perfect groom was nowhere to be found. As she came around the corner, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes darted from Declan, who was nervously fumbling with his unbuttoned tuxedo jacket near the restroom doors, to me stepping out of the secluded maintenance hallway right behind him. Declan's face was still flushed red, and he looked completely disheveled from throwing himself on the dirty floor to beg for his professional life. Jasmine looked at his messy clothes, and then looked at me standing calmly in the dim lighting. Her narcissistic brain instantly jumped to the most dramatic and flattering conclusion she could possibly invent. She assumed I was desperately trying to seduce her wealthy new husband in the dark. The idea that I was actually his ultimate boss was completely beyond her limited comprehension. She thought I was just a pathetic, jealous sister trying to ruin her magical night by throwing myself at a billionaire out of pure desperation. Her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure rage. She did not care that several affluent wedding guests were walking down the hall toward the restrooms. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at me and started screaming at the absolute top of her lungs. She called me a desperate, disgusting homewrecker. Her shrill voice echoed down the long hallway, drawing even more attention from the passing guests who stopped dead in their tracks. She yelled that I was so jealous of her perfect life and her incredible success that I had resorted to acting like a cheap streetwalker at her own wedding. The wealthy guests gasped and widened their eyes in pure shock. They whispered to each other, eager to witness the dramatic downfall of the pastor's deeply troubled daughter. Declan stood frozen against the floral wallpaper. He looked like he was about to have a massive heart attack. He wanted to speak up to stop her from digging her own grave, but he remembered my strict command to stay absolutely silent. He just stood there like a pathetic coward, letting his new bride scream at the woman who controlled his entire corporate existence. Jasmine stepped closer to me, completely invading my personal space. She smelled like expensive champagne and bitter desperation. She told the gathering crowd that I was a miserable failure who could never secure a successful man of my own. She said I was trying to steal her fairy tale ending because my own life was completely empty and meaningless. I stood perfectly still and let her scream until her throat was raw. I did not raise my voice or try to defend myself against her ridiculous accusations. My absolute calmness only made her infinitely more furious. She wanted a loud screaming match. She wanted me to look crazy and unhinged in front of her high society friends so she could play the ultimate victim. When I simply smiled at her with a look of mild amusement, she completely lost the last shred of her limited self-control. She pulled her arm back and slapped me directly across the face with all her strength. The sound of her hand striking my cheek cracked through the hallway like a loud gunshot. The crowd of wealthy guests gasped in unison. A few of the church ladies covered their mouths in dramatic horror, stepping back from the violence. My head turned slightly from the heavy impact, and a sharp, stinging sensation bloomed rapidly across my skin. But I did not fall down. I did not cry. I did not even raise my hand to touch my burning cheek. I just slowly turned my head back to look her directly in the eye. The smug satisfaction on her face began to falter immediately when she realized I was completely unfazed by her physical attack. She demanded that I leave her wedding immediately. She screamed for the venue security guards to come and throw the trash out onto the street. Declan let out a pathetic whimpering sound from the corner, but he still refused to intervene. I looked at Jasmine with a cold, empty stare that made her take a sudden step backward. I slowly reached my hand into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. Jasmine flinched slightly, clearly thinking I was going to pull out a weapon or strike her back in retaliation. Instead, I pulled out a thick folded piece of premium white paper. It was the final financial report my legal team had sent me earlier that afternoon, detailing every single toxic loan attached to her precious dermatology clinic. I held the folded document out over the carpeted floor and simply let it drop from my fingers. The heavy paper fluttered down and landed right at the tips of her expensive white satin wedding shoes. The hallway was completely silent now. The music from the ballroom seemed a million miles away. Everyone was watching us with bated breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I told Jasmine in a smooth, even tone that she did not have to worry about me trying to seduce her fake billionaire husband. I told her I would not touch a pathetic lying coward like Declan if he was the very last breathing man on the entire planet. I told her to pick up the paper and read it carefully, because it was the absolute only wedding gift she was ever going to receive from me. Jasmine scoffed loudly and crossed her arms, refusing to bend down. She claimed it was probably just a desperate fake letter I typed up to make myself look important. But her overwhelming curiosity and the intense burning stares of the crowd eventually got the better of her. She bent down awkwardly, bunching up her massive silk skirt, and picked up the paper from the floor. She unfolded it with shaking hands, expecting to read a jealous confession or a pathetic apology. Instead, her eyes landed on the bold red letters printed across the top of the very first page. Official notice of default and immediate asset seizure. I did not let her read the fine print in silence. I wanted the entire crowd of judgmental church members to hear the absolute truth about their flawless golden child. I spoke loudly and clearly so my voice carried effortlessly down the entire hall. I told everyone present that the brilliant Dr. Bride was currently $3 million in debt. I explained that she had not made a single payment on her expensive medical equipment in over 6 months. I announced that the bank had officially classified her business loans as severely toxic, and her beautiful luxury clinic was currently defaulting as we spoke. The gasps from the crowd were even louder this time. The wealthy guests started whispering, frantically pointing directly at Jasmine and her expensive custom gown that was essentially paid for with stolen money. Jasmine stared at the paper, her face turning a sickly shade of pale gray. The numbers were undeniably real, and the official bank seals were stamped right on the bottom of the page. She looked up at me with wild, terrified eyes. She shook her head back and forth desperately, trying to deny the harsh reality crashing down around her. She yelled that the paper was a complete forgery cooked up by a jealous sociopath. She screamed that her clinic was incredibly profitable and that I was just a bitter liar trying to ruin her flawless reputation. She turned to Declan and aggressively demanded that he step up and defend her honor. But Declan just stared at the floor, completely broken and silent. I let out a soft, dry laugh that echoed in the tense hallway. I told Jasmine she could scream about forgeries and jealousy all she wanted tonight, but I suggested she check her professional email inbox or perhaps call her primary commercial lender first thing on Monday morning if she wanted the ultimate proof. I told her that the shiny illusion of her perfect, successful life was completely over and the bill was finally due. I did not wait for her to formulate another pathetic excuse or throw another violent tantrum. I simply turned on my heel, leaving her standing there, clutching the notice of default in her violently shaking hands. I walked right past the stunned, whispering wedding guests, making my way toward the front exit of the hotel. The lingering, stinging sensation on my cheek meant absolutely nothing compared to the overwhelming satisfaction of watching her entire fake world begin to crumble right before my eyes. Stepping out of the hotel and into the cool Atlanta night air felt like stepping out of a suffocating cage. I handed my valet ticket to the attendant and waited quietly for my car. My phone was already buzzing in my pocket, but I ignored it completely. I drove back to my downtown penthouse, high above the city lights, and poured myself a single glass of expensive red wine. I slept peacefully for the very first time in years, but I knew the storm was far from over. Narcissistic people do not just accept defeat and walk away quietly. They double down on their lies to protect their fragile egos. By Sunday morning, the desperate retaliation had officially begun. Jasmine and Loretta wasted absolutely no time. Before the expensive wedding flowers had even wilted, they launched a massive coordinated attack on social media. I woke up to hundreds of notifications flooding my screen. Jasmine had posted a heavily edited video on her public profile. The footage was clearly taken by one of her wealthy bridesmaids who had followed her down the hallway during the reception. But the video did not show the part where Jasmine slapped me across the face. It did not show her screaming like a lunatic, or the official notice of default. I dropped at her satin shoes. It was maliciously spliced together to show only the very brief moments where I was standing near a very distressed-looking Declan in the dim lighting. It made it look exactly like I had cornered him against his will. Jasmine added a long, tearful caption underneath the scandalous video. She played the ultimate victim flawlessly. She wrote a devastating paragraph about how incredibly hard it is to have a deeply troubled sister who suffers from severe jealousy and mental instability. She claimed that I had shown up to her beautiful wedding completely uninvited and tried to seduce her new husband in a dark, secluded hallway. She said she was heartbroken and traumatized by my cruel betrayal on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Loretta immediately shared the video to her own extensive network of high society friends and church members. My mother added her own toxic commentary to the shared post. She publicly apologized to the entire community for my disgusting behavior. She claimed they had tried everything to get me the psychological help I so desperately needed, but I was simply too bitter and far gone. The coordinated smear campaign worked exactly as they intended. It provided the perfect scandalous narrative for people who already loved to gossip and judge others from their high horses. Within just a few hours, the video had thousands of views and hundreds of hateful comments. The affluent church ladies who had whispered about me at the ceremony were now actively destroying my character online. Sister Mildred commented that I was a complete disgrace to my family name and a literal instrument of the devil trying to ruin a holy union. Deacon Hayes wrote that Calvin was an absolute saint for putting up with my wicked ways for so long. The fake outrage was absolutely sickening to watch. My personal inbox was completely flooded with vile messages from strangers and distant relatives. They called me a homewrecker, a jealous failure, and a pathetic loser who could not stand to see her younger sister succeed. They told me I deserved to be alone and miserable for the rest of my life. My phone rang constantly with incoming calls from angry aunts and uncles who wanted to scream at me for embarrassing the family on such a massive public stage. Some of Jasmine's superficial friends even sent me threatening messages telling me to leave Atlanta and never show my face at another high society event ever again. They were practically foaming at the mouth, eager to tear me down to make themselves feel righteous and superior. Any normal person would have panicked under that massive wave of public hatred. A normal person would have gone online and frantically posted their side of the story. They would have screamed about the $3 million debt and Declan's failing tech company just to clear their own name. They would have posted the voice recording of Declan crying on his knees. But I am not a normal person, and I was completely done playing their exhausting defensive games. I simply turned my phone on silent mode, placed it face down on my cold marble kitchen island, and made myself a cup of black coffee. I maintained absolute radio silence. I did not block any of their accounts. I did not delete my own social media profiles, and I certainly did not issue a public statement defending my character. I let them scream into the empty void. I let them whip themselves into a massive frenzy of self-righteous anger. They thought my utter silence was a clear admission of guilt. Jasmine and Loretta genuinely believed they had successfully destroyed my reputation and chased me back into the dark shadows where I belonged. They were sitting in their beautiful houses, patting themselves on the back for winning the public relations war. But they were far too incredibly stupid to realize that public opinion does not pay off commercial bank loans. Facebook likes and sympathetic comments from old church ladies do not stop federal foreclosure proceedings. They had no idea that I was simply giving them enough rope to hang themselves completely. I sat on the balcony of my penthouse, looking out over the beautiful Atlanta skyline, and enjoyed my peaceful Sunday morning. I knew that while they were busy typing hateful comments and soaking up fake sympathy, the clock was rapidly ticking down on their entire financial reality. Tomorrow was Monday. The banks would open, the courts would be in session, and my legal team was already preparing the final strike. Their online victory was just a temporary illusion right before the ultimate collapse. Monday morning broke over Atlanta with bright sunshine and clear blue skies. But for Jasmine, the weather inside her perfect life was about to turn violently dark. She arrived at her luxury dermatology clinic just before 9 in the morning, expecting another day of commanding her staff and pretending to be a medical genius. She parked her white Range Rover in the reserved spot near the front entrance, completely ignoring the unusual number of vehicles already gathered in the parking lot. She grabbed her designer handbag and stepped out, wearing her crisp white lab coat completely oblivious to the massive financial guillotine hanging right over her head. As she walked toward the heavy glass doors, she noticed a thick metal chain wrapped securely around the handles. A massive yellow padlock hung heavily in the center, gleaming in the morning sun. Standing right in front of the doors were two uniformed Atlanta police officers, looking stern and unapproachable. Next to them stood three men in sharp gray suits, holding thick clipboards and looking entirely unsympathetic. Jasmine froze in her tracks. Her perfectly manicured hand dropped from her expensive sunglasses. She demanded to know what was going on and ordered the officers to remove the chains immediately so she could open her clinic for the day. The tallest man in this gray suit stepped forward and asked her to confirm her identity. When she proudly stated she was Dr. Jasmine, the owner of the facility, the man simply nodded and handed her a thick stack of legal documents. He introduced himself as the primary asset recovery agent for the commercial bank that originally funded her business. He spoke in a loud, clear voice that carried across the parking lot, easily reaching the ears of several early morning patients who were waiting in their cars. He informed her that her business was officially in default. He stated that her property, medical equipment, and all associated assets were now legally seized by the new primary debt holder, Vanguard Apex Venture Capital. Jasmine snatched the papers from his hand and began scanning them frantically. The official notice of default she had received at her wedding reception was not a fake piece of paper after all. The numbers on the official bank documents perfectly matched the numbers on the paper I had dropped at her feet. The reality of the situation hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. She started screaming at the recovery agent, calling him a liar and a fraud. She claimed there was a massive mistake and that she was a highly respected doctor who always paid her bills on time. She tried to push past the police officers to get into the building, but they firmly blocked her path, warning her that any attempt to enter the premises would result in her immediate arrest for criminal trespassing. The scene quickly devolved into absolute chaos. Jasmine's waiting patients began getting out of their cars, demanding to know what was happening to their scheduled appointments. Some of them had already prepaid thousands of dollars for expensive laser treatments and Botox injections. They surrounded Jasmine, demanding answers and refunds. Jasmine was completely overwhelmed. Her perfect facade cracked into a million tiny pieces right there in the parking lot. She tried to pacify the angry crowd with empty promises, claiming it was just a minor administrative error that would be fixed in a matter of hours. But the massive metal chains on the door and the presence of the police told a very different story. In pure desperation, she pulled her brand new iPhone out of her designer bag and started frantically calling Declan. She needed her billionaire husband to swoop in and save her from this humiliating nightmare. She dialed his number over and over again, her fingers shaking so badly she kept dropping the phone. The first time she called, the line rang endlessly before going to his automated voicemail. The second time she called, the line was busy. By the fourth time she called, the phone went straight to a generic automated message stating the number she was trying to reach was currently unavailable or turned off completely. Jasmine let out a loud, frustrated scream right in the middle of the parking lot. She could not understand why her loving new husband was ignoring her desperate calls. She thought he was just busy in an important morning meeting. She did not know that at that exact moment, Declan was sitting in his own glass-walled office downtown, sweating profusely, while a team of aggressive forensic accountants tore through his company servers. His startup was currently undergoing a massive surprise audit orchestrated by Vanguard Apex, and he was drowning in his own sea of fraudulent financial records. He had intentionally turned off his personal phone because he knew exactly what was happening at Jasmine's clinic, and he was absolutely terrified of being dragged down with her. The recovery agent calmly informed Jasmine that a moving crew would be arriving within the hour to begin cataloging and removing all the expensive laser machines from the building. He advised her to contact a bankruptcy attorney immediately because the debt she owed was far greater than the total value of her seized assets. The angry patients started shouting louder, demanding their money back right then and there. Someone even started recording the humiliating scene on their phone, capturing Jasmine's complete public meltdown. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing hysterically, as her entire medical empire was officially locked down and taken away from her. The golden child who had spent her entire life belittling me for my supposed failures was now standing in a parking lot completely bankrupt and publicly humiliated, while the police watched her cry. The humiliating scene in the clinic parking lot spread through our tight-knit community faster than a wildfire. Someone had posted the video of Jasmine screaming at the police online, and it was rapidly gaining thousands of views. The pristine image of the successful Dr. Bride was completely shattered before lunchtime. Calvin and Loretta were sitting in their massive living room, fielding frantic phone calls from concerned church members when Jasmine finally burst through the front door. Her designer clothes were crumpled, and her makeup was completely ruined from crying. She threw herself onto the expensive leather sofa and demanded that Calvin fix the massive disaster immediately. She wailed that the bank had taken everything and that Declan was completely unreachable. Calvin immediately sprang into action, desperate to save his golden child from public ruin. He could not stand the thought of his congregation seeing his perfect family fall from grace. He told Loretta to handle the incoming phone calls while he went into his private home office to make some urgent financial arrangements. He closed the heavy oak door, locked it from the inside, and booted up his personal computer. He knew he had to liquidate assets quickly, to pay off the $3 million debt and get Jasmine's clinic unchained before the local news stations picked up the scandalous story. He started transferring money from his personal savings, but it was not nearly enough. He frantically tried to cash out his retirement funds, but the penalties and processing times were far too long. Out of pure desperation, he opened a hidden encrypted folder on his desktop. It was a highly confidential ledger that he had meticulously maintained for the past 7 years. It contained the detailed financial records of the church's massive charity fund, a fund specifically designated to help underprivileged families and provide scholarships for local minority students. For years, Calvin had been quietly skimming money off the top of the charity fund. He justified it in his twisted mind by telling himself that he worked incredibly hard for the congregation and deserved a little extra compensation. But the reality was far more sinister. The hidden ledger showed hundreds of thousands of dollars being funneled into private offshore accounts. That stolen money was the exact source of Jasmine's extravagant lifestyle. The charity fund had paid for her luxury European vacations, her expensive designer handbags, and the massive down payment on her flashy white Range Rover. The good pastor had literally robbed the poor to fund his daughter's ridiculous vanity. In his blind panic to cover Jasmine's $3 million default, Calvin made a fatal, catastrophic error. He tried to initiate a massive wire transfer from the hidden offshore account directly to the commercial bank holding Jasmine's debt. But because the amount was so unusually large and the account was flagged for suspicious international activity, the bank immediately froze the transaction. An automated fraud alert was automatically generated and sent directly to the primary contact email associated with the church's financial board, the very same email account that Loretta managed as the head of the church's administrative committee. Loretta was sitting in the living room trying to calm Jasmine down when her tablet suddenly chimed loudly with an urgent email notification. She opened the message expecting another concerned message from a church elder. Instead, she stared in absolute horror at the automated fraud alert. It detailed a massive blocked transfer attempting to pay off Jasmine's clinic debt using funds directly linked to the church's charity accounts. Loretta was incredibly superficial and toxic, but she was not a thief. She had built her entire identity around being the perfectly respectable, deeply moral pastor's wife. She prided herself on her high society connections and her flawless reputation in the community. She read the email again, her hands trembling violently. She realized instantly what Calvin had been doing all these years. The sudden influx of cash, the unexplainable luxury gifts, the lavish wedding that they supposedly could not afford without taking out a second mortgage. It all clicked into place. The perfect lifestyle they had been flaunting to everyone was built entirely on stolen charity money. The realization hit her like a freight train. If this massive fraud was exposed, it would not just be a minor social embarrassment. It would be a massive federal crime. Calvin would be stripped of his pastoral license and thrown into federal prison. Their massive colonial house would be seized, and she would be left completely destitute and publicly disgraced. Loretta slowly stood up from her chair, clutching the tablet so tightly her knuckles turned white. She walked over to the leather sofa where Jasmine was still sobbing loudly about her ruined clinic. Loretta looked down at her golden child with a completely new expression. It was not love or concern. It was pure, unadulterated hatred. She realized that Jasmine's endless greed and Calvin's desperate need to spoil her had literally destroyed their entire family. Jasmine looked up, wiping her tear-stained face, expecting her mother to offer comforting words. Instead, Loretta pulled her arm back and delivered a vicious, open-handed slap directly across Jasmine's cheek. The sound echoed loudly in the massive living room. It was significantly harder than the slap Jasmine had given me in the hotel hallway. Jasmine's head snapped to the side and she let out a loud gasp of pure shock. She touched her burning face, staring up at her mother in complete disbelief. Loretta leaned down, her face twisted with absolute fury. She shoved the tablet directly into Jasmine's face, forcing her to look at the fraud alert. She screamed at Jasmine, calling her a greedy, selfish parasite. She told her that her endless demands for luxury had turned her father into a common criminal. She yelled that the respectable family name was completely ruined forever, all because Jasmine needed to play the role of a wealthy, successful doctor using stolen money. The golden child was completely speechless. The illusion of their perfect family was dead, and they were finally turning on each other like starving wolves. Jasmine held her stinging cheek and looked up at her furious mother. The room was completely silent, except for Calvin's heavy breathing near the office door. For the very first time in her entire life, Jasmine realized she was entirely on her own. Her parents were not going to protect her anymore because she had become a massive liability to their precious reputation. The stinging pain on her face was nothing compared to the absolute panic rising in her chest. Her narcissistic brain immediately kicked into survival mode. She could not accept being the villain of the story, and she absolutely refused to lose her golden child status. She quickly wiped her tears, smearing her expensive mascara across her cheeks. She took a deep breath and forced a look of absolute unshakable confidence onto her face. She stood up from the expensive leather sofa and smoothed out her ruined designer clothes. She looked directly at Loretta and told her to stop panicking over a simple administrative misunderstanding. She raised her voice and declared that Declan was a legitimate tech billionaire with endless financial resources. She lied smoothly and effortlessly, claiming that Declan had already promised to pay off the clinic debt weeks ago if the commercial bank ever caused any trouble. She said he was just wrapped up in a massive corporate merger this morning, which was exactly why his personal phone was temporarily turned off. She insisted that his executive assistants handled all his minor financial transactions, and they must have simply forgotten to wire the money on Friday afternoon. She spun a beautiful and desperate fairy tale right there in the living room and delivered it with absolute conviction. She told Calvin that Declan had massive liquid assets and could easily cut a check for $3 million without even checking his bank balance. She promised her parents that her perfect husband would not only save her luxury medical clinic, but he would completely replenish the stolen charity fund before anyone at the church ever noticed the missing money. She painted a picture of a wealthy, powerful man who would sweep in and fix all of their problems with a single signature. Calvin and Loretta stared at her with wide, desperate eyes. They were highly intelligent people who usually saw through deception, but blind fear had completely clouded their judgment. The terrifying reality of federal prison, the loss of their massive house, and total public humiliation in front of their congregation was so unbearable that they actively chose to believe her ridiculous lies. They desperately needed Declan to be their absolute savior. Calvin let out a massive, heavy sigh of relief and wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. He told Jasmine to get her purse and get in the car immediately. He said they were not going to sit around the house waiting for Declan to check his voicemail. They were going to drive directly to his corporate headquarters and demand the money right this second. Loretta agreed, nodding her head frantically. She rushed to the hallway mirror to quickly fix her hair and reapply her expensive bright red lipstick. She absolutely refused to look like a desperate beggar when she walked into her rich son-in-law's prestigious office. The three of them piled into Calvin's black luxury sedan and sped off toward the downtown financial district. The atmosphere inside the car was a truly bizarre mix of extreme anxiety and returning toxic arrogance. Jasmine sat in the passenger seat, flipping down the sun visor mirror. She furiously reapplied her makeup and practiced exactly what she was going to say to the front desk receptionist. She fully convinced herself that Declan was just busy playing the role of a vital CEO and would gladly drop everything the second his beautiful bride walked through the glass doors. Calvin gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. He kept muttering under his breath about how this entire ordeal was merely a test of their immense faith, and that a higher power was going to provide a massive financial miracle through his new wealthy son-in-law. Loretta sat in the back seat, aggressively typing emails on her tablet to the church elders. She crafted a lie about a sudden family emergency to explain Calvin's absence from his daily pastoral duties, trying to buy them a few more hours of precious time. They completely ignored the massive glowing warning signs staring them right in the face. They did not stop to wonder why a supposed billionaire had let his wife's medical clinic be publicly chained up by the local police in front of her own patients. Their massive entitlement completely blinded them to the absolute truth. The car finally pulled up to a massive towering glass skyscraper right in the heart of the busy city. The building was sleek, modern, and screamed untouchable corporate wealth. The bold silver letters of Declan's health tech startup were proudly displayed high above the grand entrance. Jasmine stepped out of the car acting like she personally owned the entire block. She lifted her chin, threw her designer bag over her shoulder, and strutted toward the revolving glass doors with Calvin and Loretta trailing closely behind her. They walked exactly like an entitled royal family, expecting a massive parade in their honor. What they absolutely did not know was the extreme severity of the situation currently unfolding on the top floor of that very building. Today was not just a regular Monday at the office. It was the day of the most crucial and intense board of directors meeting in the entire history of the startup. Declan was currently trapped in a glass-walled conference room, surrounded by angry investors, aggressive forensic accountants, and highly paid corporate lawyers. He was quite literally fighting to stay out of federal prison himself. Vanguard Apex had quietly frozen all of his operational funds overnight, and the powerful board was actively preparing to vote on his immediate removal as chief executive officer. The lobby was absolutely swarming with anxious employees carrying cardboard boxes and security guards, looking incredibly tense. Jasmine, Calvin, and Loretta marched right through the front doors, completely oblivious to the thick, suffocating atmosphere of corporate doom. They walked confidently into the massive marble lobby, ready to demand their $3 million bailout from a desperate man who currently did not even have enough money to pay for his own lunch. The stage was perfectly set for the ultimate explosive collision of two massive sinking ships. The glass revolving doors of the corporate high-rise spun rapidly as Jasmine, Calvin, and Loretta marched into the massive lobby. The ceiling was easily 40 feet high, with an enormous abstract chandelier hanging above a sleek black granite reception desk. The air was cool and smelled of expensive floor wax and money. Several security guards in dark suits stood near the stainless steel elevator banks, checking identification badges with strict precision. Jasmine walked straight past the velvet ropes, completely ignoring the line of corporate visitors waiting to sign in. She slammed her designer handbag down on the shiny black granite desk, startling the young receptionist who was busy answering a multi-line phone system. Jasmine leaned over the desk, her eyes wide and frantic. She demanded that the receptionist immediately page Declan Gallagher. She stated loudly and proudly that she was his new wife and that he needed to come down to the lobby right this instant to handle a massive family emergency. The young receptionist blinked in surprise, looking at Jasmine's crumpled designer clothes and smeared makeup. She politely informed Jasmine that Mr. Gallagher was currently in a highly secure closed-door meeting with the board of directors and could not be disturbed under any circumstances. She offered to leave a priority message for his executive assistant. Jasmine slammed her hand flat on the granite desk, producing a loud crack that echoed across the quiet lobby. She screamed that she did not care about a stupid board meeting. She yelled that she needed $3 million right now because her medical clinic was currently chained shut by the police. Several executives walking through the lobby stopped in their tracks, turning their heads to watch the unbelievable scene unfolding near the front desk. Calvin stepped up beside his daughter, puffing out his chest. He tried to use his booming pastoral voice to intimidate the young receptionist. He commanded her to pick up the phone and call the top floor immediately, claiming that he was a highly respected community leader, and they were currently dealing with a severe bank error that his billionaire son-in-law needed to fix. Loretta joined the chorus of demands, tapping her sharp fingernails impatiently against the desk. She told the receptionist that if she did not call Declan down right now, they would personally ensure she was fired before her lunch break. The pure entitlement radiating from the three of them was absolutely suffocating. The receptionist, looking incredibly panicked, pressed a silent panic button hidden under her desk. Within seconds, 4 large security guards walked briskly over to the reception area. The head guard, a tall, muscular man with a stern face, calmly asked the family to step away from the desk and lower their voices. Jasmine spun around and pointed her finger aggressively at the head guard. She screamed that they had absolutely no right to touch her, because she practically owned this entire building. She yelled that she was Dr. Jasmine Gallagher, the wife of the CEO, and she demanded total respect. Calvin started arguing loudly with the other guards, claiming religious persecution and threatening to sue the entire corporation for emotional distress. The situation was rapidly escalating into a massive public spectacle. The security guards, realizing that physical removal might cause an even bigger scene in front of important clients, reluctantly decided to call the top floor directly to verify Jasmine's identity. Up on the 42nd floor inside the glass-walled boardroom, Declan was currently sweating profusely under the harsh interrogation of the board members. His personal assistant quietly slipped into the room and whispered urgently into his ear. Declan turned ashen gray. He excused himself from the intense meeting, claiming a sudden bio break, and rushed out to the elevators. He rode down to the lobby, his heart pounding violently against his ribs. He prayed that it was just a simple misunderstanding, but he knew deep down that his nightmare had fully arrived. When the elevator doors slid open, the loud sound of Jasmine's screaming hit him like a physical blow. He saw his new wife, his father-in-law, and his mother-in-law completely surrounded by security guards in the center of his corporate lobby. Dozens of employees and important clients were watching them, recording the embarrassing scene on their smartphones. Declan felt a massive wave of pure humiliation wash over his entire body. He practically sprinted across the lobby, waving his hands frantically at the security guards to stand down. Jasmine saw him coming, and her face lit up with a twisted look of relief and righteous anger. She pushed past a guard and grabbed Declan's expensive suit jacket. She demanded to know why he had his phone turned off when she was dealing with a massive crisis. She started rambling frantically about the police, the chains on her clinic doors, and the $3 million default. She commanded him to write her a massive check right this second, or initiate an emergency wire transfer to the commercial bank. She told him to fix the problem so she could go back and fire the recovery agent standing in her parking lot. Declan grabbed her arms, trying desperately to quiet her down. He looked around the massive lobby, terrified that a major investor might walk through the front doors at any second. He whispered frantically to Jasmine, begging her to lower her voice. He told her she needed to leave the building immediately because she was completely ruining his life. He said he did not have $3 million. He confessed in a rapid, panicked whisper that he did not even have $3,000 right now. He told her the company funds were entirely frozen and he was currently under a massive federal audit for financial irregularities. Jasmine stared at him, her brain completely unable to process the words coming out of his mouth. She asked him what he meant by frozen. She reminded him that he was a tech billionaire who just threw $1 million wedding. Calvin and Loretta leaned in close, demanding an explanation. Declan looked at his furious father-in-law and his demanding mother-in-law, and the last shred of his billionaire facade finally broke. His voice cracked as he admitted that the entire wedding, the expensive cars, the lavish lifestyle, it was all funded by early investor capital that he was never supposed to touch. He was completely broke and the board was about to fire him. The realization hit Jasmine with the force of a speeding truck. The perfect billionaire savior she had just bragged about to her parents was nothing but a pathetic, penniless fraud. The man she had married to elevate her social status was entirely fake. All the fear, the stress, and the deep humiliation from the morning suddenly boiled over into raw, explosive rage. She did not care about the security guards or the dozens of people watching. She did not care about his corporate reputation. She pulled her arm back and delivered a brutal, stinging slap directly across Declan's face. The sound echoed sharply across the massive marble lobby, silencing the entire room instantly. She screamed that he was a pathetic liar and a massive failure, and that he had completely ruined her perfect life. Declan stood there holding his red cheek, completely humiliated and utterly broken, while the security guards finally moved in to physically escort the screaming family out of the building. As the security guards rushed forward to grab Jasmine's arms, Calvin stepped directly into their path. He used his massive physical presence to block them. In the absolute chaos of the moment, Jasmine looked down and saw Declan's executive keycard dangling loosely from his belt clip. Her desperate mind made a split-second decision. She ripped the keycard right off his belt, turned around, and sprinted toward the private executive elevator bank. Loretta immediately followed her daughter, leaving Calvin to shove his way past the stunned security guards. He broke free and joined them just as the heavy metal doors began to close. Declan screamed at the guards to stop the elevator, but it was entirely too late. The digital display above the doors lit up, indicating the car was shooting straight up to the 42nd floor. Inside the elevator, the atmosphere was a toxic mixture of heavy adrenaline and pure delusion. Jasmine stared at her reflection in the mirrored walls, trying to fix her messy hair. She frantically tried to convince herself that Declan was just playing a sick, twisted game. She told her parents that he was probably just testing her loyalty or hiding his massive personal wealth from the greedy board of directors. Calvin agreed completely, adjusting his crooked tie and practicing his most intimidating pastoral glare. Loretta clutched her designer purse tightly, repeating over and over that they were absolutely not going to leave the building without their $3 million. They were completely blinded by their own massive egos and ignored the terrifying reality of the situation they were about to walk into. The elevator chimed softly, and the doors slid open onto the ultra-exclusive executive floor. The 42nd floor was entirely different from the bustling, noisy lobby down below. It was dead silent, featuring plush, dark wool carpets, rich mahogany walls, and massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire sprawling city. A single, highly paid executive assistant sat behind a custom white marble desk guarding the entrance to the main boardroom. She stood up immediately, holding out her hand to stop them, but Calvin simply shoved right past her. He told her in his booming, aggressive voice to get out of the way because they were family and they had highly urgent corporate business to handle. The main boardroom was enclosed entirely in thick, soundproof glass. Inside, 12 elite board members sat around a massive, custom-built conference table. These were incredibly powerful, wealthy white men and women who controlled billions of dollars in global assets. They were currently looking at complex financial projections displayed on a massive glowing screen. They were completely unaware of the massive tornado heading directly for them. Jasmine did not bother knocking. She grabbed the heavy stainless steel handles and pushed the double glass doors wide open with all her remaining strength. The heavy doors banged loudly against the glass walls, shattering the intense professional silence of the room. All 12 board members snapped their heads toward the entrance in absolute shock. The chairman of the board, an older man with silver hair and a sharp-tailored suit, slowly lowered his reading glasses. He stared at the uninvited guests and calmly demanded to know who they were and how they had breached the highly secure floor. Jasmine marched right to the head of the long table, acting like she was the supreme ruler of the entire corporation. She slammed her hands down hard on the polished wood surface, scattering several highly important financial documents. She loudly announced that she was the CEO's brand new wife, and she was completely taking over the meeting until her strict financial demands were met. Calvin and Loretta flanked her on both sides, creating the ultimate cringe-inducing spectacle. Calvin pointed his thick finger directly at the chairman of the board. He used his loud preaching voice to declare that this company owed his family $3 million to save a vital medical facility. He claimed that as the powerful father-in-law of the chief executive, he had full legal rights to company funds. He stated loudly that he was not leaving the room without a certified bank draft to clear his daughter's completely unfair debt. Loretta chimed in from the side, demanding that someone fetch them some sparkling water while they waited for the massive wire transfer to be processed. She looked down her nose at the billionaire board members, treating them exactly like hired catering staff. The board members exchanged long, silent looks of absolute disbelief. They were not intimidated in the slightest. They were entirely disgusted by the raw ignorance standing before them. One of the female board members, a ruthless venture capitalist from New York, let out a cold, dry laugh. She leaned back in her expensive leather chair, looked directly at Jasmine, and asked if she was genuinely out of her mind. She clearly informed the deeply confused family that Declan was currently under severe federal investigation for massive corporate fraud. She stated that the company operating accounts were completely frozen by their primary investor due to gross financial mismanagement. She told Jasmine that her pathetic husband did not even own the fancy leather chair he was sitting on, let alone a spare $3 million to bail out a failed luxury dermatology clinic. Instead of realizing their massive fatal mistake, Jasmine completely doubled down. Her extreme narcissism simply would not allow her to accept defeat in front of these elite strangers. She screamed that they were all lying to protect their own greedy corporate profits. She threw a massive childish tantrum right there in the middle of the sophisticated boardroom. She yelled that she was going to personally sue the entire board of directors for emotional distress and deliberate financial sabotage. Calvin started shouting loudly about religious persecution, claiming that these rich corporate elites were deliberately trying to destroy a prominent, respected family out of pure spite. It was the most embarrassing and humiliating display of sheer ignorance and blind entitlement that the corporate floor had ever witnessed in its entire history. The chairman of the board calmly pressed a small silver button on the intercom system built right into the table. He requested the highest level of armed building security to come up immediately and physically remove the crazy trespassers. He looked at Jasmine with eyes as cold as solid winter ice. He told her that her husband was a pathetic criminal who had actively lied to them for 2 long years. He noted dryly that she was clearly just as delusional and unstable as he was. Loretta gasped loudly, clutching her expensive pearls, acting deeply offended by the harsh, unvarnished truth. They stood there frozen in the center of the transparent glass room, completely surrounded by the most powerful people in the city, making absolute fools of themselves. They had completely destroyed whatever tiny shred of dignity they had left, and the real nightmare was only just walking through the door. The thick tension in the glass boardroom was suddenly broken by the sharp ding of the private executive elevator arriving on the 42nd floor. The heavy double doors of the boardroom were already pushed wide open from Jasmine's dramatic entrance, so everyone inside had a perfectly clear view of the hallway. The elite board members turned their heads away from the screaming family, expecting building security to finally arrive with handcuffs. Instead, they saw a highly coordinated team of professionals marching purposefully down the plush, carpeted hallway. At the very front of the group, leading the pack with absolute unquestionable authority, was me. I was not wearing a simple understated outfit like I did at the wedding. I was wearing a razor-sharp, custom-tailored Tom Ford power suit in deep charcoal gray. My hair was perfectly styled, and my posture was completely rigid. Walking tightly in step behind me were 5 of the most expensive and ruthless corporate lawyers on Wall Street. They carried sleek leather briefcases and wore expressions of absolute stone-cold, serious intent. The high-priced executive assistant out front did not even try to stop us. She simply stood up straight and nodded her head in deep respect as we swept past her marble desk. I walked straight through the double glass doors and into the chaotic boardroom. The sudden change in atmosphere was absolutely instantaneous. The screaming arguments completely died down. The board members who had been glaring at Jasmine's family suddenly sat up straight in their expensive leather chairs, fixing their ties and adjusting their posture. They instantly recognized the immense power walking into the room. Jasmine, Calvin, and Loretta, however, were completely confused. They stared at me in absolute disbelief. They could not process why the pathetic family failure was currently walking into a secure corporate boardroom flanked by a massive legal team. Calvin, recovering from his initial shock, immediately assumed I had followed them there to beg for forgiveness or ask for a handout. His pastoral arrogance flared up instantly. He pointed his thick finger at me, his face turning bright red with pure indignation. He used his booming church voice to order me out of the room. He yelled that this was a private business meeting for important people and I had absolutely no right to be there. He told me to take my cheap rented lawyers and go back to my tiny apartment before he had me arrested for stalking and corporate espionage. Loretta chimed in, crossing her arms and rolling her eyes dramatically. She told the board members to completely ignore me, claiming I was her deeply mentally unstable daughter who was currently suffering from a severe psychotic break. Jasmine just smirked, a triumphant look spreading across her face. She thought my presence was the ultimate proof of my pathetic jealousy. She told me to leave immediately because I was completely embarrassing myself in front of her new billionaire husband. I did not say a single word to my family. I completely ignored their pathetic, toxic noise exactly like I would ignore a barking dog on the street. I simply walked to the absolute head of the massive custom conference table, stopping right next to the silver-haired chairman of the board. He immediately stood up out of his chair, offering it to me as a sign of complete deference. I remained standing, placing my hands flat on the polished wood surface. I looked slowly around the room, making direct eye contact with every single elite board member present. The lead lawyer of my legal team, a tall, imposing man named Harrison, stepped forward. He unlatched his sleek briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of incredibly important legal documents, all stamped with the official seal of Vanguard Apex Venture Capital. He dropped the heavy stack of papers right onto the center of the table, the loud thud echoing sharply in the quiet room. Harrison cleared his throat and addressed the room with a voice that demanded absolute total attention. He told the board of directors that he was the chief legal counsel for Vanguard Apex. He then turned, slightly gesturing respectfully toward me. He formally introduced me to the room, completely shattering my family's entire perceived reality in one single breath. He announced loudly and clearly that I was Valerie Williams, the primary founder and sole shadow chairwoman of the Vanguard Apex Venture Capital Fund. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy, practically suffocating. Calvin dropped his hand, his mouth falling open in pure, unadulterated shock. Loretta's eyes widened to the size of saucers, her expensive pearls slipping from her fingers. Jasmine literally took a physical step backwards, stumbling slightly in her expensive designer heels. She looked at me, and then looked at the stack of official legal documents on the table, her brain completely short-circuiting. Harrison was not finished. He continued his devastating announcement, outlining the exact financial structure of the corporation. He informed the room and my completely paralyzed family that through a series of aggressive debt restructuring and massive capital injections over the past 72 hours, my firm had officially acquired a supermajority holding in the health tech startup. He looked directly at Jasmine, who was currently hyperventilating, and delivered the final, absolute crushing blow. He stated very clearly that as of 9 o'clock this morning, Miss Williams officially owns 65% of this entire company, making her the absolute undisputed majority shareholder and the ultimate boss of every single person in this building. Declan, who had been standing silently in the corner looking like a beaten dog, finally let out a pathetic whimpering sound. He knew it was completely over. The elite board members immediately began murmuring amongst themselves, nodding in respectful agreement to the new corporate reality. They did not care about the messy family drama, they only cared about the massive wealth and power currently standing at the head of their table. I finally turned my head and looked directly at Calvin. His face had drained of all color, leaving him looking like a sick old man. I kept my voice low, even and incredibly cold. I asked him if he still wanted to order me out of my own boardroom. I asked him if he still wanted to call security to arrest the woman who literally owned the entire building he was currently standing in. Calvin tried to speak, but his throat was completely dry. He just made a pathetic croaking sound, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for any possible escape route. The mighty, respected pastor was completely stripped of all his false power, reduced to absolutely nothing in front of the daughter he had spent his entire life trying to destroy. I turned my attention away from his pathetic, trembling face and looked directly at the chairman of the board. I nodded once, and the chairman immediately understood the unspoken command. He formally opened the emergency floor vote, right there in front of everyone. He proposed the immediate termination of Declan Gallagher as Chief Executive Officer, citing gross financial negligence and malicious fraud. The vote was entirely unanimous. 12 hands went up in the air without a single second of hesitation. Declan let out a loud, gut-wrenching sob from his dark corner of the room. He collapsed onto his knees, crying uncontrollably, begging the board members to reconsider. He promised he could fix the numbers if they just gave him one more week. I looked down at him with utter disgust and told him his access badge was already deactivated. I ordered him to leave his company-issued phone and laptop on the table and informed him that the federal authorities were already waiting for him in the lobby. Two corporate security guards who had rushed up the elevator right behind my legal team stepped forward and grabbed Declan by his arms. They hauled him to his feet, completely ignoring his pathetic crying. Jasmine watched in absolute horror as the security guards dragged her fake billionaire husband out of the glass boardroom. The glamorous fairy tale she had violently demanded just an hour ago was being physically dragged away to federal prison. But I was not quite finished with her yet. The real explosive payoff was still waiting patiently inside my lawyer's leather briefcase. I gestured to Harrison, and he quickly produced a second stack of thick manila folders. He placed them carefully on the polished wood surface, right in front of where Jasmine and Loretta were standing. I walked over and tapped the top folder with my index finger. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the sheer magnitude of my words sink into their toxic brains. I told Jasmine that she came to my building looking for a $3 million bailout from a man who was stealing money to pay for his own groceries. I told her that the commercial bank had not made any mistakes when they chained her luxury clinic doors shut this morning. I explained that Vanguard Apex Venture Capital specializes in acquiring toxic debt from failing businesses. I told her I personally authorized the purchase of her massive clinic loans. Jasmine started shaking her head aggressively, trying to deny the heavy truth crushing her lungs. She whispered that it was impossible and that family members could not legally buy each other out like that. I smiled warmly and informed her that business is just business. I told her I was the sole legal owner of every single piece of expensive medical equipment, every leather waiting room chair, and the entire building lease. I told her she was completely bankrupt and owed me millions of dollars she could never repay. Loretta stepped forward, her hands shaking violently. She tried to play the role of the peacemaker, attempting to use her motherly authority one last time. She put on a fake shaky smile and told me that this was just a massive misunderstanding between sisters. She said we could all go back to the house, sit down at the kitchen table, and work out a reasonable payment plan like a good Christian family. She told me I had proved my point and showed everyone how successful I was, so it was time to stop this cruel joke. I picked up the second manila folder and slid it across the smooth table directly into Loretta's trembling hands. I told her there was no house to go back to. The fake smile completely vanished from her face. She opened the folder and stared at the legal documents inside. I explained loudly so the entire board of directors could hear the absolute truth about their so-called perfect family. I told them that Calvin had secretly leveraged the remaining equity in their massive colonial home to secure a secondary line of credit for Jasmine's failing business. I told Loretta that when Jasmine defaulted on her clinic loans, the bank legally attached the debt to their residential property. Loretta let out a loud, piercing shriek that rattled the thick glass walls of the boardroom. The realization hit her instantly. By purchasing Jasmine's toxic debt, I had simultaneously acquired the legal deed to their perfect suburban fortress. I told Loretta and Calvin that I was now the legal owner of the house they had lived in for 30 years. The very same house they had threatened to throw me out of when I was a struggling college student. The very same house they had mortgaged to pay for a fake wedding while refusing to help me pay for my basic education. Calvin fell back against the glass wall, clutching his chest as if he was having a massive heart attack. His breathing was ragged and shallow. He realized that his massive embezzlement from the church charity fund was completely exposed. His daughter was bankrupt. His son-in-law was going to prison, and he had literally handed the deed to his home directly to the daughter he despised. Loretta collapsed onto the expensive wool carpet, weeping hysterically and tearing at her expensive clothes. Jasmine just stood there, completely frozen, staring blankly at the wall like her mind had entirely snapped under the immense pressure. They were completely broken, stripped of their wealth, their fake status, and their toxic pride. The elite board members watched the absolute destruction of the family in stunned silence. I looked down at the three people who had made my entire life a living hell. I felt absolutely no pity and no remorse. I had not stolen anything from them. I had simply let their own massive greed and endless arrogance lead them directly into a trap of their own making. I pressed the silver button on the intercom system one more time. I looked at the head of building security standing near the elevator bank. I pointed my finger directly at my sobbing mother, my catatonic father, and my completely ruined sister. I used a voice colder than freezing ice. I ordered the security team to gather the three trespassers and throw them entirely out of my building. I instructed the guards to make absolutely sure they used the service elevator in the back so they would not disturb any of the important clients in the main lobby. I told them to throw them out onto the hot pavement exactly where they belonged. The guards moved in immediately, grabbing Calvin and Loretta by their arms. Jasmine let out one final desperate scream as they pulled her away from the table. But the heavy glass doors quickly swung shut behind them, cutting off the pathetic noise entirely. The sound of their frantic crying and pathetic begging faded away as the security team dragged them down the long corridor toward the freight elevators. The heavy silence returned to the boardroom, thick and absolute. I stood at the head of the polished table, taking a slow, deep breath of the cool air. The lingering smell of Jasmine's expensive perfume was already fading away, replaced by the crisp scent of corporate victory. The board members were staring at me with a completely new level of intense respect and deeply rooted fear. They had just watched a woman completely dismantle her entire toxic family without shedding a single tear or raising her voice above a calm conversational level. They knew exactly what kind of ruthless leader was now holding the reins of their lucrative corporation. I smoothed down the lapels of my tailored suit and pulled out my favorite leather chair at the absolute center of the table. I sat down gracefully, crossing my legs and folding my hands neatly in my lap. I looked at the silver-haired chairman and gave him a polite, professional smile. I told the board of directors that the unfortunate family distraction was completely resolved and would absolutely never happen again. I opened my sleek briefcase and pulled out the new financial projections for the upcoming quarter. I told the room that it was time to get back to the serious business of making money and cleaning up the massive mess my former brother-in-law had left behind. The meeting resumed instantly, and nobody ever dared to mention my ruined family again. The news of the massive corporate takeover at Vanguard Apex did not just stay on the 42nd floor. It spread through the downtown financial district like a massive tidal wave, and within 24 hours, the brutal consequences began raining down on my family. Declan was held in federal custody for 2 full days while the authorities combed through his fraudulent startup records. The second he was released on bail, he realized the absolute magnitude of the financial trap he was caught in. He knew that staying married to a woman with $3 million in toxic commercial debt would completely destroy whatever tiny chance he had left at a normal life or a plea deal. He did not even wait a full week to make his move. On Wednesday morning, Jasmine's phone buzzed with an urgent notification from a cheap local law firm. Declan had immediately filed for an emergency annulment, citing gross misrepresentation and massive hidden financial liabilities on her part. He completely threw her under the bus to save his own pathetic skin, claiming she had tricked him into marriage to pay off her failing clinic. The billionaire fairy tale marriage she had bragged about to the entire city lasted exactly 72 miserable hours before ending in a stack of cheap divorce papers served to her at a budget motel where she was hiding from the press. But Declan's cowardly exit was just the very beginning of the absolute destruction. Calvin's massive embezzlement from the church charity fund could not be hidden behind locked doors anymore. When he attempted that massive wire transfer to save Jasmine's clinic, the automated fraud alert had not just gone to Loretta's tablet. It had also been sent to the personal email inboxes of 3 other senior church deacons who sat on the Financial Oversight Committee. By Tuesday evening, the deacons had called a mandatory emergency meeting of the entire congregation board. They demanded to see the hidden ledger, and Calvin had absolutely no way to cover his tracks. When the truth finally came out, the reaction was absolutely explosive. The tight-knit community that had worshipped Calvin for decades completely turned on him overnight. They realized that the luxury cars, the expensive suits, and the lavish wedding were all paid for with money meant for struggling single mothers and college scholarships for underprivileged kids. The betrayal was so deep and so personal that the church board did not just fire him. They officially stripped him of his pastoral license, completely excommunicated him from the congregation, and handed all of his financial records directly to the local district attorney. Calvin, the proud and arrogant man who used to command thousands of people from his massive pulpit, was now facing multiple felony charges for wire fraud and grand larceny. He was forced to surrender his passport and wait for a highly publicized criminal trial that would undoubtedly end in a lengthy federal prison sentence. The local news stations ran his mugshot on the evening broadcast, completely destroying his pristine image forever. Loretta was completely shattered by the sheer speed of their downfall. She had spent her entire adult life carefully cultivating the perfect image of a high society pastor's wife. She thrived on the jealousy and admiration of the other church ladies. Now she was the ultimate pariah. When the foreclosure papers for the massive colonial house became public record, her wealthy friends dropped her instantly. The women she used to have expensive brunches with stopped answering her phone calls. They blocked her number and crossed the street when they saw her walking toward them. She was forced to pack up 30 years of memories into cheap cardboard boxes, while the asset recovery agent stood in her living room, watching her every move. She had to leave behind her expensive grand piano, her custom furniture, and her sparkling crystal chandeliers. She and Calvin had to move into a tiny, damp, one-bedroom apartment on the absolute outskirts of the city. It was exactly the kind of cheap, depressing apartment they had mocked me for living in when I first started my career. Every time Loretta walked into that cramped kitchen, she was violently reminded that her entire perfect life had been built on a massive lie that finally collapsed under its own heavy weight. She cried every single night, mourning the loss of her social status, more than she mourned the loss of her family. And then there was Jasmine, the ultimate golden child, the beautiful, successful doctor, the absolute pride of the family. Her fall from grace was the most spectacular of all. She went from wearing a custom silk gown and drinking imported champagne to having absolutely nothing to her name in the blink of an eye. The medical board launched a full investigation into her clinic and suspended her license to practice dermatology pending a massive financial review. Without her clinic, without her fake billionaire husband, and without our parents' stolen money to fund her lifestyle, she was completely exposed to the harsh real world. She tried to reach out to the wealthy bridesmaids who had stood next to her at the altar just days ago, but they wanted nothing to do with her. They had seen the viral video of her screaming in the parking lot, and they knew her family was under federal investigation. They completely shunned her, treating her like a highly contagious disease. She could not even get a job as a receptionist because her name was plastered all over the local gossip blogs. Jasmine was forced to move into the tiny apartment with Calvin and Loretta sleeping on a cheap thin air mattress in their cramped living room. The tiny space was constantly filled with loud, toxic arguments. Loretta blamed Jasmine for demanding too much luxury and ruining their lives. Calvin blamed the devil for testing his faith completely, refusing to take responsibility for his own massive greed. Jasmine blamed Declan for being a pathetic fraud and blamed her parents for not having more money hidden away. They were all trapped in a miserable little box of their own making, completely tearing each other apart day after day. They had spent their entire lives pushing me away and telling me I was the family failure. Now they were sitting in the dark surrounded by cheap cardboard boxes, while the entire city laughed at their massive public disgrace. The Golden Princess had finally become the ultimate penniless outcast, entirely forgotten by the very same community she had sacrificed my mental health to impress. It was a poetic and perfectly balanced justice that no amount of screaming or crying could ever undo. It was late Friday evening when the heavy wooden door of my grandmother's downtown apartment finally received the knock I had been expecting all week. The city outside was drenched in a cold, heavy rain, matching the miserable reality my parents were currently drowning in. I was sitting on the vintage velvet sofa, drinking a cup of hot chamomile tea, and enjoying the absolute quiet of my sanctuary. This was the exact same apartment they had tried to steal from me just a few days ago to fund Jasmine's fake medical empire. Now, it was the only piece of property in the family that was completely free of toxic debt. The knocking started out slow and hesitant, but quickly grew into a desperate, frantic pounding echoing loudly through the small hallway. I set my teacup down on the coffee table and walked slowly toward the door. I did not look through the peephole because I already knew exactly who was standing on the other side. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, revealing Calvin and Loretta standing in the dim light of the hallway. The sight of them was genuinely shocking. The massive, powerful pastor and his flawless high society wife were completely gone. Calvin was wearing a damp, wrinkled trench coat, his shoulders slumped forward and his eyes dark and sunken. He looked like he had aged 20 years in a single week. Loretta looked even worse. Her perfectly styled hair was flat and stringy, sticking to her wet cheeks. She was not wearing her signature pearl necklace or her expensive designer heels. She was clutching a cheap plastic umbrella, shivering in the cold draft of the building corridor. The absolute second the door opened, Loretta let out a loud, pathetic wail and tried to throw her arms around my neck. I took a quick, sharp step backward, holding my hand up to physically stop her from touching me. She hit an invisible wall of pure ice and stumbled slightly, her face crumpling into a mask of pure devastation. She fell to her knees right there on the cheap carpet of the hallway, crying hysterically. She begged me to forgive them. She pleaded with me to remember the good times we had when I was a little girl, completely ignoring the fact that those good times never actually existed. She sobbed that they had nowhere else to go, and that sleeping in that tiny damp rental apartment was literally killing her spirit. Calvin stood over her, heavily leaning against the doorframe for physical support. The arrogant man who had proudly threatened to erase me from the family tree at the rehearsal dinner was now openly weeping. He tried to use his old manipulative tactics, but his booming pastoral voice was reduced to a pathetic, shaky whisper. He told me that God teaches us about radical forgiveness and unconditional grace. He begged me to find it in my heart to show mercy to the people who gave me life. He swore that he had learned his lesson and that he would spend the rest of his miserable life making it up to me if I would just call the asset recovery agents and give them their massive colonial house back. He said they were completely ruined and that I had already extracted my ultimate revenge. I stood in the doorway looking down at the two people who had spent my entire life making me feel like an absolute worthless burden. I searched my heart for even a tiny fraction of pity or remorse, but I found absolutely nothing. The emotional well was completely dry. I did not feel angry or vindictive anymore. I just felt an overwhelming sense of profound boredom. Watching them beg on their knees did not bring me joy. It just validated every single boundary I had ever built to protect myself from their endless toxicity. I held my hand up, demanding absolute silence. Loretta's hysterical sobbing slowly faded into wet, pathetic hiccups. Calvin wiped his nose with the back of his hand, looking up at me with wide, desperate eyes. I told them to wait right there, and I turned my back on them, walking deeper into the apartment. I went to the small wooden desk near the window and picked up a thick manila envelope that I had prepared earlier that morning. I walked back to the front door, holding the heavy envelope in my right hand. Calvin and Loretta stared at the brown paper, their eyes lighting up with a sudden burst of desperate hope. They genuinely thought I had gone to get a checkbook or a set of keys to save them from their self-inflicted misery. I looked directly at Calvin and reminded him of the horrible dinner we had before Jasmine's ridiculous wedding. I reminded him of the moment he stood over me in the private dining room and slammed a manila envelope on my plate, demanding that I sign away my grandmother's apartment. I told him that he had threatened to completely destroy my life if I did not sacrifice my only safe haven to feed Jasmine's endless greed. I watched the desperate hope completely drain out of his eyes, replaced by a sickening wave of pure dread. I tossed the thick manila envelope directly onto the floor right next to Loretta's wet knees. The heavy paper slapped against the carpet, echoing in the quiet hallway. I told them to open it. Loretta reached out with violently trembling hands and pulled the documents out of the envelope. They were the exact same property transfer papers that Brother Davis, the corrupt church lawyer, had drafted for the wedding. But my legal team had made a few necessary adjustments. My name was no longer listed as the person giving away the property. Instead, Calvin and Loretta's names were printed clearly at the top, transferring the legal deed of their massive suburban house entirely over to Vanguard Apex Venture Capital to cover their massive stolen debts. I pointed at the second document in the stack. I told them to look very closely at the official court seal stamped at the bottom of the page. It was a legal notice of absolute eviction. I kept my voice entirely calm and devoid of any human emotion. I told them that they had exactly 24 hours to return to the house and remove their remaining personal belongings before my private security team arrived to change all the locks and board up the windows. I told them that the massive home they had used to show off their fake wealth and look down on the rest of the community was going to be completely demolished next month to make room for a new commercial development project. Loretta let out another piercing scream, dropping the papers as if they had physically burned her skin. Calvin reached out, trying to grab the doorframe to stop himself from collapsing completely. He gasped for air, telling me I could not possibly be this cruel to my own flesh and blood. He asked me how I could sleep at night knowing my parents were completely homeless and destitute. I looked him dead in the eye and gave him the exact same cold smile he had given me when he told me I was dead to the family. I told him that flesh and blood meant absolutely nothing when it was poisoned. I told him he was the one who wanted me off his prestigious family tree, so I simply chopped the entire toxic tree down to the roots. I told them never to come near my apartment or my business ever again. I did not wait for another pathetic apology or another desperate excuse. I stepped back inside, pushed the heavy wooden door shut, and locked the deadbolt with a loud, satisfying click, completely silencing their desperate cries forever. The heavy wooden door remained firmly shut, blocking out the cold rain and the pathetic, desperate cries of the people who had raised me. I walked away from the entrance feeling a massive weight physically lifting off my chest with every single step I took. The heavy, suffocating chains of familial obligation were finally completely shattered. I walked over to my large bay window, looking down at the wet city streets far below. The flashing red and blue lights of the city traffic reflected off the wet pavement, mirroring the chaotic storm I had just successfully navigated. I did not feel an ounce of regret. I had given them exactly what they had asked for all those years ago: total, absolute separation. The next morning, I officially changed my personal phone number. I instructed my doorman and the building security team to permanently ban Calvin, Loretta, and Jasmine from entering the premises under any circumstances. I had my legal team draft airtight cease and desist letters, completely barring them from contacting me at my home, my office, or through any third-party associates. I went completely and strictly no contact. It was not a temporary punishment or a manipulative silent treatment to get them to apologize. It was a permanent, lifelong boundary, carefully constructed to protect my hard-earned peace. The massive demolition of the colonial house proceeded exactly as planned the following month. I did not go to watch the wrecking ball tear through the manicured lawn or the expensive brick facade. I simply signed the development paperwork and let the past crumble into absolute dust. The new commercial plaza built on that exact spot generated millions in additional revenue for Vanguard Apex. But the real profit was the absolute silence in my personal life. The toxic constant background noise of their complaints, their demands, and their brutal comparisons was finally gone forever. Fast forward 6 months, and the harsh winter rain had finally given way to a warm, beautiful Atlanta spring. The sliding glass doors of my penthouse balcony were thrown wide open, letting the gentle evening breeze sweep through the massive living space. The apartment was not quiet and empty anymore. It was filled with genuine laughter, warm conversations, and the clinking of expensive crystal glasses. I was hosting a private dinner party to celebrate the successful launch of a new global tech initiative. But the people standing in my living room were not just business associates or high society strangers. They were my chosen family. They were the brilliant, fiercely loyal people who had stood by me when I was broke working 3 jobs and trying to build my empire from the absolute ground up. My chief legal counsel Harrison was there laughing loudly at a joke told by my oldest friend and business mentor Sarah. They were the people who knew the real Valerie Williams. They did not care about fake titles or keeping up appearances for the local church community. They loved and respected me for my drive, my integrity, and my absolute refusal to let my past dictate my future. I stood near the edge of the balcony holding a glass of vintage champagne, looking out over the sprawling illuminated city. The skyline was a glittering sea of endless possibilities, and I finally owned a massive piece of it. The journey from being the despised family scapegoat to becoming a powerful shadow billionaire was incredibly painful and isolating at times. There were countless nights when I questioned my own sanity, wondering if I really was the selfish failure my parents constantly accused me of being. But standing there, surrounded by genuine love and unshakable success, I knew the absolute truth. The greatest revenge is not just exposing the toxic people who tried to break you. The greatest revenge is completely removing their power over your emotions and building a beautiful, independent life that they are completely forbidden from entering. We are constantly taught that blood is thicker than water and that family is the most important thing in the world regardless of how they treat us. But that is a dangerous, manipulative lie designed to keep vulnerable people trapped in cycles of abuse. True family is not determined by a shared last name or biology. True family is determined by consistent respect, genuine support, and the willingness to see your true value, even when you are struggling. I had to completely destroy my biological family tree to finally plant the seeds of my own authentic life. And the beautiful garden that grew from those ashes was worth every single moment of pain. If you are watching this and you are currently trapped in a toxic family dynamic where you are constantly belittled, compared, and used, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Their inability to see your worth does not decrease your absolute value. You are not a failure just because you refuse to play the rigged game they created. The most powerful thing you can do is silently build your own kingdom brick by brick until you are completely untouchable. Do not wait for their conditional approval because it will absolutely never come. Save your energy, protect your boundaries, and invest everything you have into your own glorious independence. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to finally find your own peace and success? How did you find the ultimate courage to finally establish those strict boundaries? I would genuinely love to hear your incredible stories of resilience and triumph in the comments section down below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to finally find the strength to walk away. If my journey resonated with you, please hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more authentic stories about taking your power back. Share this video with anyone who needs a strong reminder that the best revenge is always massive, undeniable success. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that your ultimate peace is always worth the heavy price of walking away.